Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're diving deep into the political blueprint for division, and we're exploring Jason Stanley's really foundational work, How Fascism Works, the politics of us and them.
The core question Stanley helps us get at is just so crucial. It's how do these political systems consistently generate authoritarian and ultranationalist movement?
Right, regardless of the country or the specific time period or the culture.
Exactly. We're trying to look past the individual leaders or, singular policies to really identify the recurring structures and the rhetorical mechanisms, the how of it all.
And what's so relevant right now is just how timely this analysis is. I mean, Stanley points out that ultranationalism, it's been taking hold in multiple countries globally.
Everywhere, it seems.
Russia, Hungary, Poland, India, Turkey, and critically the United States. So this isn't some, abstract historical comparison.
Right.
It's a necessary generalization so you can recognize these common systems when they pop up again in new forms.
Exactly. So our mission here is to keep a calm, analytical focus. We want to explain these exportable mechanisms, what he calls the politics of us and them. We want to understand, structurally how these systems produce such predictable, divisive, and frankly, dangerous outcomes by actively breaking apart liberal democracy.
It's about understanding the engine, isn't it? Not just complaining about the driver.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Okay.
Okay, so let's unpack the context of this book and the author a bit.
Sure.
Jason Stanley, he's the Jacob Borowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He's very established. He previously won the Pierre Award for his book, How Propaganda Works.
So his expertise is really in the mechanics of political language, how truth gets manipulated.
Right. But it's his personal history that really gives this work such a sense of urgency.
It really does. I mean, Stanley was raised by parents who were refugees. They fled Europe, they fled anti-Semitism. His own father escaped Nazi Germany in 1939.
And the book is dedicated to his children's generation. You can just feel his concern that these political threats are cyclical. They're not just relics of the past.
No, not at all. And he includes this incredibly powerful story about his father, late in life, gravely ill, but insisting on visiting the beaches of Normandy.
Just to honor the American sacrifice against fascism.
Right. But Stanley uses that story to contrast that heroic American legacy with a much darker truth. American ideas of freedom, they've never been monolithic.
That juxtaposition is really the critical starting point for the whole book, isn't it?
It is. Stanley points directly to the pro-fascist, anti-immigrant sentiment of the 1930s America First movement. And that was led by a hugely celebrated American hero, Charles Lindbergh.
It's still shocking to think about. I mean, Lindbergh, this public icon, what exactly did he say?
Well, in a 1939 article in Reader's Digest, Lindbergh basically urged Americans to retreat into a form of white nationalism.
He said it was time to, what was it? Turn from our quarrels and to build our white ramparts again.
That's the one. He warned against alliance with foreign races and the danger of being engulfed in a limitless foreign sea.
And this was happening at a time when the Immigration Act of 1924 had already drastically restricted immigration. It was specifically targeting non-whites and Jews.
And Stanley's father was one of the very last to barely make it out in 1939.
So fast forward, when that America First slogan was revived in 2016, and the administration started pursuing travel bans, singling out Arab countries, setting refugee caps at the lowest numbers in decades, Stanley saw history repeating itself.
He saw the structural use of fear repeating itself.
Exactly.
Because this revival happened at a time when, as Stanley notes, refugees were once again on the road everywhere. Their suffering was being exploited to reinforce this propaganda that the nation is under siege by aliens.
So this brings us to the book's central thesis. Stanley defines fascism not just as a historical moment, but as a definable political system. How would you put that in plain language?
At its core, fascism is ultranationalism. It can be ethnic, religious, or cultural. And in this system, the core identity of the nation gets represented in the person of an authoritarian leader.
The one who claims to speak on its behalf.
The only one who can. And so the book's main function is to identify and analyze the 10 predictable interconnected mechanisms, the tool set, really, that political actors consistently use to break apart liberal democracy and promote that authoritarian us versus them system.
Okay, let's jump into those mechanisms now. The first one Stanley identifies seems to be the absolute structural foundation for everything else. It's the invention of the mythic past and patriarchal hierarchy.
Right, and fascist movements, they always claim to originate in some kind of invented or pure mythic past.
So it's an idealized history,
Mhm.
racially pure, religiously pure, culturally pristine.
And its destruction is always blamed squarely on liberal forces or globalism or, intellectual decadence.
So what's the core insight here? It's not just that they're nostalgic, is it?
No, not at all. The core insight is that the myth has to be fabricated to justify a hierarchy in the present day.
So the history is a tool.
Exactly. Mussolini was incredibly clear about this back in 1922. He said, "We have created our myth. The myth is a faith, a passion. It is not necessary for it to be a reality. Our myth is the nation."
Wow. So the history doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be functional.
It has to be functional. It has to dictate how society should look and behave now. And Stanley shows that this invented history is almost always presented as having survived only in, the traditions of small towns in the countryside.
The places that are unpolluted by the liberal decadence of the cities.
Precisely. And this myth always, always anchors itself around an extremely rigid patriarchal family structure.
And that connection is vital, isn't it?
It's everything, because it links that simple, relatable nostalgia directly to a central, unchallengeable authoritarian hierarchy.
The leader becomes the father figure, the provider.
And the chief value that gets celebrated in that society is just unquestioning strength.
So if you want absolute power now, you have to invent a tradition that mandates your power structure.
Right.
And it always starts with controlling women and the family unit.
Absolutely. Fascist politics dictates very precise gender roles. I mean, look at Nazi Germany. Gregor Strasser, the Reich propaganda chief, he proclaimed that military service was the most profound participation for men.
And motherhood for women.
While for women, it was motherhood. The official policy bearer put it even more simply. To be a woman means to be a mother.
And we see this exact mechanism resurfacing globally, even today.
Hmm.
In Poland, you had the right-wing Law and Justice Party, PS, trying to nearly eliminate exceptions for abortion.
Which led to those mass street demonstrations by women, right, resisting that specific patriarchal control.
Exactly. Or you can look at the Hutu 10 Commandments in Rwanda. The Hutu woman was defined only by her role as a mother.
And as someone responsible for maintaining Hutu ethnic purity.
It wasn't subtle at all. I think the second commandment literally defined Hutu daughters as more suitable and conscientious in their role as woman, wife, and mother of the family.
And that just reveals the core dynamic Stanley is tracking. Growing gender equity, it represents a direct threat to that patriarchal hierarchy.
So it generates immense gender anxiety.
An anxiety that fascist politics has to address.
Yeah.
Even in American politics, you see leaders who claim to champion and revere women, like Paul Ryan did, but they use language that still defines them as figures needing protection.
Positioning them in a subordinate, dependent role.
It's a classic tactical move. By casting women as revered but, threatened figures, the movement gives men a simple, unifying political problem to solve.
Protect the purity of the nation's women.
Right, and that's so much easier than grappling with complex, challenging issues like economic freedom or genuine social equality. The hierarchy gets restored, but under the guise of chivalry.
So if the underlying goals are control and hierarchy, the system has to have a way to conceal them. Which brings us to the second mechanism, propaganda and the attack on expertise. If you have problematic goals, you have to conceal them behind virtuous, unifying ideals.
That is the functional definition of propaganda in this system. And Stanley gives this chilling example of Richard Nixon's war on crime.
The public rhetoric was all about law and order.
Pure law and order. But the true goal, the real goal, was revealed in the diary notes of his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman.
What did those notes say? It was pretty explicit, wasn't it?
Incredibly explicit. Haldeman recorded Nixon saying, quote, "You have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to."
Wow. So the virtuous ideal law and order was just a mask.
Just a mask for a racist political agenda aimed at suppressing dissent and marginalizing a specific group.
What's so paradoxical about this is that the rhetoric often focuses on corruption. These movements launch these fierce anti-corruption campaigns, promising to drain the swamp.
Even though, as Stanley notes, the politicians driving that rhetoric are frequently vastly more corrupt themselves.
It's the ultimate deflection.
It is. The historian Richard Grunberger noted that the Nazis convinced people that democracy itself meant corruption. And then they proceeded to build a governmental system that, it just dwarfed the scandals of the Weimar regime.
So the anti-corruption rhetoric gives them the unifying grievance. It lets them dismiss all existing institutions as contaminated.
Exactly. Which is where it gets truly insidious. We move to the inversion of ideals. Fascism strategically uses core democratic values against democracy itself.
Frederick Douglass saw this perfectly, didn't he?
He did. Back in 1852, he asked what the 4th of July, this huge celebration of liberty, what does that mean to an enslaved man? He called it inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony.
So the very concept of liberty was weaponized.
Yes. In the American South, states' rights was the phrase used to defend the liberty to oppress and own other human beings.
And today, we see this inversion constantly with free speech.
All the time. The idea of free speech is pushed to its absolute limits specifically to destroy the possibility of public discourse itself.
You mean by encouraging hateful or violent rhetoric?
Exactly. When the white nationalist Jeremy Joseph Christian was accused of that brutal terrorist attack in Portland, he shouted, "Free speech or die," in the courtroom.
And Stanley's point is that this kind of rhetoric, especially when it's coupled with violence and hate, it doesn't promote freedom.
No, it destroys the possibility of the reasoned, mutual debate that free speech is supposed to facilitate. It subverts the entire ideal.
We also saw a version of this with the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions when they repeatedly pressed charges against that woman, Desiree Feruz.
Just for chuckling?
Just for chuckling at a confirmation hearing. They used the full power of the state to punish this tiny, trivial expression of dissent.
And yet, that same Jeff Sessions was simultaneously giving speeches tearing into university campuses for failing to uphold free speech.
Arguing they were discouraging right-leaning voices.
It's a perfect tactical maneuver. You attack the only institutions that offer real, complex free speech protections, like tenured faculty, while you're simultaneously suppressing peaceful dissent in other areas.
That dynamic just leads right into the next piece of the puzzle. Anti-intellectualism. This is absolutely essential for dismantling democratic systems.
You have to attack expertise, academia, the arts. You brand them all as partisan or decadent or leftist ideological agents.
And this delegitimization, it serves a really crucial singular purpose, doesn't it?
It does. It allows the authoritarian leader to reject consultation and deliberation entirely. If the experts are all corrupt or biased or part of some global conspiracy,
then the strongman doesn't need data. He doesn't need checks and balances.
No. The French fascist Pierre Drew La Rochelle described the fascist leader as a man of action who rejects culture. It is a man who only believes in acts and carries out these acts in line with a nebulous myth.
So the leader becomes the sole source of legitimate knowledge.
Yes. And we see this tactic playing out everywhere. From David Horowitz's decades-long campaign listing the most dangerous professors,
Right.
to local legislative attacks on the very foundation of academic freedom itself. There was a Missouri lawmaker, Rick Bratton, who called tenure un-American while he was pushing a bill to ban it.
Arguing that professors shouldn't be engaged in political or controversial subjects.
The irony is just stunning, and the political elite often specifically targets areas of study that foster democratic citizenship and self-reflection.
Like in North Carolina, when Republican leaders criticized the university for teaching gender studies or Swahili.
Suggesting that if you want those courses, you should go to a private school.
And this kind of attack is supported by economic elites, isn't it? Through organizations like the Pope Center.
For sure. They push for funding cuts to humanities and social sciences, and they want to replace them with purely skills-based education.
But Stanley points out that these are the very subjects that foster critical thinking, historical literacy, and cultural diversity.
The exact tools you need to resist fascism.
So if the education system is repurposed to just glorify the mythic past, and the press is deemed biased, then trust in all institutions is completely eroded.
Right.
So how does the system maintain control when there's no shared framework for truth? And that brings us to the next critical mechanism, the collapse of reality, unreality, and conspiracy.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really dark. Once the press and the universities are delegitimized, the very foundation for reasoned public discourse is it's destroyed.
The whole information space is wrecked.
It is, and it creates this massive vacuum that gets filled by conspiracy theories. And these theories are a critical mechanism because they simplify really complex problems.
And they automatically delegitimize the mainstream media, which is then accused of censorship or bias for not covering them.
Exactly. The history here is just so deeply worrying because the pattern is so clear.
It really is.
The entire basis for Nazi ideology was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Which was a complete fabrication, a hoax plagiarized from, what, an old political satire.
An 1864 political satire about tyranny. But the protocols claimed that Jews orchestrated democracy, capitalism, and communism, all just masks for Jewish interests to achieve world domination.
And prominent Nazis like Hitler and Goebbels based their actual policies on this lie.
And that template is it's copied and pasted into the modern era. You just replace the Jewish cabal with new enemies.
So you get birtherism claiming Obama was born in Kenya.
Or Pizzagate, which led to an armed man attacking a DC pizzeria based on a completely bizarre theory about child trafficking.
Right, and globally you have Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban using the Soros plan.
Claiming the Jewish financier George Soros has a plan to flood Hungary with non-Christian migrants to destroy their national identity. It's the same script.
So the question for you, for the listener, has to be, why do people accept such strange, evidence-free conspiracies?
Hannah Arendt, the great theorist of totalitarianism, she explained their effectiveness perfectly. She observed that modern masses, once they're detached from trusted institutions, do not trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations.
So they're convinced not by facts, but by the consistency of the system of beliefs.
That's it. The theory doesn't have to be plausible in reality. It just has to be consistent within the system of xenophobic fear that the demagogue has created.
That makes so much sense.
Think about the Texas American Laws for American Courts bill, which was intended to block Sharia law.
The factual possibility of that actually happening is basically zero.
Negligible. But within the system of narratives created by people like Orban and others, it makes simple, consistent sense of the intense, irrational, xenophobic fear people are feeling. It provides a simple explanation for irrational emotions.
And this feeds directly into what Stanley calls the impoverishment of public discourse. Language itself starts to break.
This is where we have to look at Victor Klemper's concept of LTI, the lingua tertii imperi, which means the language of the Third Reich. Klemperer showed how the Nazi language transformed German by constantly reusing certain words until they just lost their meaning.
And only evoked fanatical emotion.
Right, so the goal isn't just to lie, it's to actively break the tools of language itself.
That's a key analytical point, isn't it?
It is. Hitler was explicit about this in Mein Kampf. He declared that propaganda should adapt its intellectual level to the receptive ability of the least in-group member.
So the purpose of this kind of language isn't to reason.
No, it's to eliminate the possibility of robust, nuanced debate by serving only what he called the cause of invocation.
Klemperer noted that the LTI exists solely to, quote, strip everyone of their individuality, to paralyze them as personalities, to make them into unthinking and docile cattle.
And when political discussion is reduced to just fanatical emotion, the news inevitably transforms. It goes from being a conduit of information into a spectacle or simple tribal identification.
Steve Bannon basically confirmed this approach, didn't he?
He did. He said, "We got elected on drain the swamp, lock her up, build a wall. This was pure anger. Anger and fear is what gets people to the polls. Once reality collapses, all that's left is tribal anger."
So if reality has collapsed and anger is what matters, who decides the truth?
Well, that's where the appeal to natural hierarchy comes in. This brings us to the structural ideology behind it all, hierarchy and the politics of victimhood. Fascist ideology fundamentally rejects liberal democracy's premise of equality. It claims that nature imposes these immutable hierarchies of power and dominance.
It sounds a lot like social dominance theory, which studies these legitimation myths that support hierarchies.
Exactly. And the core tactic, then, is to present liberal equality as a kind of Trojan horse.
How does that work?
Stanley points out how the Protocols of the Elders of Zion literally instructs the reader to infect the opponent with the idea of freedom, so-called liberalism.
So the theory is that if the dominant group accepts political freedom, they'll grant equal status to outgroups,
who will then seize power. And that, in their minds, confirms that equality was just a trick all along.
So equality itself gets framed as the very mechanism used by outgroups, Jews, non-whites, feminists, whoever, to seize power from the dominant group.
Which leads directly to the crucial mechanism of dominant group victimhood. Any progress toward equality is consistently framed as discrimination against the formerly dominant group.
The historical resonance here is It's inescapable.
It is. After the Civil War, Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act, arguing that it discriminated against white people.
And W.E.B. Du Bois observed the same thing, that even the most minimal safeguards for black citizens were immediately perceived by the dominant white group as discrimination against the white race.
And contemporary psychological research really backs this up. The status anxiety is real. Studies show that white Americans tend to wildly overestimate how much racial equality has actually been achieved.
So they perceive that rectifying a historical injustice, even a little bit, brings pain to those who benefited from the oppression.
Exactly. And fascist politics exploits that perceived status loss. Other research shows that just the prospect of becoming a majority-minority country dramatically affects white Americans' political ideology. It fuels the sense of status threat and perceived victimization.
It's not necessarily about economics, then.
Not always. It's often about a deeply felt loss of cultural and racial dominance.
And we see this global use of victimhood narratives to justify horrific violence and power grabs.
Absolutely. Look at Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. He used this dramatically exaggerated narrative of Serbian victimization,
Blaming a defeat at the Battle of Kosovo from centuries earlier on a lack of Serbian unity.
to consolidate power and justify ethnic nationalist violence against Albanians, whom he accused of committing cultural genocide.
It's the same logic in Hungary today.
It is. Prime Minister Viktor Orban declares Christianity the world's most persecuted religion to unify his audience. He positions himself as the mythic defender of Christian Europe against barbarian, lawless hordes,
It allows him to claim the moral authority of a victim.
and justify deeply anti-immigrant and oppressive policies. The key is that the powerful group always sees itself as the victim under threat.
Okay, so the final mechanisms we need to analyze. These relate directly to the political economy and social control. They create what Stanley calls the duality of worth. Law, labor, and the duality of worth. He shows how demagogues use law and order rhetoric to create these deep us versus them distinctions. They do this by describing non-dominant groups, like Black Americans or immigrants, as inherently criminals.
The infamous case of the Central Park Five is a perfect example. They were entirely exonerated by DNA evidence.
And yet they were publicly described as crazed misfits. Donald Trump even called for their execution.
It just illustrates the deep resonance of this idea of racialized criminality. Non-dominant groups are positioned as threats to the very notion of national order and safety.
And Stanley brings in this fascinating piece of social psychology that helps explain how this stereotype solidifies. It's called linguistic intergroup bias.
This is a core mechanism of perception, yeah. Psychologists find that when a member of the us group does something bad, we describe it concretely.
Like, he stole a chocolate bar.
Right, which suggests it was a one-off mistake. But if a member of the them group does the same thing, we describe it abstractly, which imputes a permanent negative character trait.
He is a thief, or he's a criminal.
And the bias works in reverse for positive actions.
I see. So good actions by us are abstract? She's generous?
But good actions by them are concrete. She gave $1 to charity.
So it systematically reinforces the perception that the outgroup has these permanently threatening negative traits, while our flaws are just, situational mistakes.
And that justifies punitive policies. It fed directly into the terrifying system of mass incarceration in the U.S.
The prison population just exploded, from 500,000 in 1980 to over 2.3 million by 2013.
And it fell disproportionately on Black Americans. Stanley notes that more Black Americans are incarcerated than white Americans, even though they're only 13% of the population.
And the intellectual cover for this came from pseudoscience, didn't it? Forging this fictional link between race and criminality.
Constantly. In 1896, you had Frederick Hoffman publish Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro, asserting Black Americans were uniquely violent and lazy, which was used to justify segregation.
Then, a century later, in 1996, you have the book Body Count Warning of a coming wave of young, cruel super predators.
A theory that was treated as credible even though violent crime was already falling. And it was used to justify draconian policies like charging juveniles as adults and mandatory minimums.
That deep racial asymmetry is just so clear when you contrast it with how the opioid crisis has been framed. That crisis is often associated with rural whites and displaced industrial workers. How is the narrative framing different?
It's treated entirely as a public health epidemic. It requires compassion, prevention, treatment. Even President Trump spoke about the need for care.
The contrast is just. It's stark.
For one group, crime is an intrinsic trait that requires punishment. For the other, it's a sickness that requires state compassion and resources. It perfectly highlights the duality of worth that's inherent in the system.
And that duality extends to labor. That infamous phrase over the concentration camp gates, Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free.
That is the fascist logic of work. The system stereotypes the them group as lazy, parasitic takers who only want state largesse,
Contrasting them with the hardworking noble us.
so the out group has to be cured of their alleged defect through forced labor or punitive economic policies.
Paul Ryan's famous makers versus takers vocabulary feeds directly into this ideology, doesn't it? Framing economic success as a moral virtue and poverty as a moral failing.
And it's often based on these racialized stereotypes. Research confirms this link. According to the Princeton political scientist Martin Gilens, the single largest predictor of white Americans' opposition to welfare
Is the perception that black people are lazy.
That's it. It's not primarily about economic self-interest or tax burden. It's about racialized perceptions of worth that sustain the political division.
And finally, Stanley shows the system has to destroy solidarity to prevent people from uniting along class lines. Why are labor unions so dangerous to this system?
Well, Hannah Arendt argued that fascism requires individuals to be atomized, to lose their mutual connection across race, gender, and regional differences.
And labor unions are dangerous because they are one of the most effective institutions for creating mutual bonds along lines of class.
Which cuts right through the state-mandated divisions of race or religion.
And the history of right-to-work laws is explicit about this racist anti-solidarity motivation.
Absolutely. I mean, these laws, which forbid unions from collecting dues while requiring them to provide equal representation, it's a mechanism designed to starve them of funds.
They were first proposed in Texas in the 1940s by a lobbyist named Vance Muse.
And Muse was explicit about his anti-union agenda. He used racist panic to attack the racially progressive CIO unions.
What was the specific language he used to stoke that panic? It was pretty awful.
It was. He warned that white women and white men will be forced into organizations with black African apes whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs.
So the name right to work is just pure Orwellian propaganda.
For legislation explicitly designed to destroy workers' collective bargaining power and reinforce racial hierarchy over class unity. By attacking unions and the social safety net, the system maintains its economic hierarchy and prevents class-based solidarity from distracting from the central conflict of us versus them.
Okay, so now that we've established these 10 interconnected mechanisms, from the mythic past all the way to destroying solidarity, let's use Stanley's work to map out how they function together, how they create a self-perpetuating, stable system.
Right, let's connect the dots. We can identify, I think, 3 primary groups of actors whose interests are temporarily aligned in this political structure.
Okay.
First, you have the authoritarian leader. They centralize power, simplify all the grievances, and they embody the mythic nation, that patriarchal man of action.
Okay, that's one.
Second, the conservative economic elite. This includes powerful donors and lobbyists like the historical Vance Muse or, contemporary groups like the Koch Network.
And these actors provide the funding and legislation for the anti-intellectual and anti-labor agendas.
Exactly, and they benefit directly from deregulation and the ideal of meritocracy that justifies their wealth.
And the third group?
The third group is the traditionalist citizens, the core us group. They're motivated primarily by resentment, by a fear of status loss, and a desire for the dignity they believe they'll find in restoring that mythic past.
And the targeted out groups, minorities, women, refugees, intellectuals, labor, they're just the objects used to unify the first 3 groups.
They're the common enemy.
It sounds like Stanley is arguing that the authoritarian leader isn't even the primary beneficiary of the system. They're just the public face for the conservative economic elite who want to maintain the economic status quo. Is that the key insight?
Yes, that's the crucial structural insight here. The incentives driving behavior are different for each actor, but they align perfectly.
How so?
Well, the leaders gain absolute authority by simplifying complex problems and offering a clear, controllable enemy. The traditionalist citizens, they receive a powerful psychic wage, a restored dignity, by affirming their hierarchical superiority over the them group.
And meanwhile, the economic elites get to minimize regulation and protect their hierarchical workplaces and their accumulated wealth.
Everyone gets what they want, in a way. And the core narratives shaping all decisions revolve around 2 main assumptions: belief in a lost, pure past, and the idea of a fundamental natural hierarchy. Social Darwinism, basically.
So decisions get based on emotional appeals, xenophobic fears, sexual anxiety, that justify policies that are fundamentally oppressive but are made to appear virtuous.
Like calling the destruction of unions a right to work.
Exactly. And this system is pretty much guaranteed to persist because of these powerful feedback loops.
Let's talk about those. The first, and maybe the most critical, is the dignity-resentment loop.
Okay, how does that loop function in our daily politics?
When real structural failures happen, like economic stagnation, rising automation, or status anxiety, they get blamed on external or vulnerable takers or lazy criminals, the outgroups.
Instead of in the structural issues themselves.
Right, and this narrative channels the frustration and anger of the traditionalist citizens away from the elites who benefit from the economic system and redirects it toward the vulnerable them group.
So the elites get a two-for-one benefit. They maintain their economic freedom without regulation, and the anger that should be directed at their policies is safely redirected at immigrants or marginalized groups.
Which just reinforces the system's stability. The system literally feeds on resentment, but only when that resentment is aimed at the correct target.
And the second loop is the unreality loop.
Right. By systematically delegitimizing universities and the press, the public starts to accept false or even bizarre conspiracy theories based on that concept of consistency we talked about.
And the practical outcome of this is just policy paralysis, isn't it?
It is. This collapse of a shared reality paralyzes any productive policy debate. I mean, if you view the scientific press as a hostile ideological force, you can't have a serious discussion about climate policy.
If you believe your political opponents are, child trafficking Satanists, you can't compromise on a budget bill.
Right. And this leaves the strongman leader free to control the national narrative through sheer emotional force.
And finally, there's the perpetuation of stereotype loop. This is where the initial lies become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yes. Policies rooted in racial bias, like mass incarceration, are imposed based on the initial false stereotype of the criminal.
But these punitive policies then create devastating social conditions like unemployment, marginalization, cyclical poverty that then seem to validate the original false stereotypes.
The outgroup looks lazy or criminal because the system made them that way. The system creates the evidence for its own original lie.
And Stanley invokes Lewis Gordon, who calls the persistence of this cycle bad faith.
It's the willful ignorance of the elite, the refusal to acknowledge the systemic roots of poverty and criminality that ensures the entire oppressive system can persist indefinitely.
Looking at these mechanisms all mapped out, the present-day implications are just. They're clear and they're disturbing. Let's talk about how these systems impact modern institutions and culture, starting with governance and the economy.
Right. That tension Hitler identified between democratic politics and an authoritarian private enterprise structure, it remains deeply unstable.
The economic libertarian ideal, which defines freedom as unconstrained free markets. That aligns perfectly with these systems, doesn't it?
It does, because it justifies deep economic inequality through a social Darwinist concept of meritocracy.
The makers deserve their wealth because they succeeded, and the takers deserve their poverty because they failed. It's a philosophy that fits perfectly within a rigid hierarchy.
And that underlying assumption of social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, is deeply anti-democratic. Hitler himself extolled what he called the Führer principle in business.
He saw the CEO, who issues unchallenged orders, as the ideal models for political leadership.
He did. He warned that a democratic political sphere would inevitably clash with an authoritarian economic sphere because the state always tends to encroach on business with democratically imposed regulations.
So the goal of the elite is to eliminate that democratic encroachment.
And this authoritarian impulse extends immediately into culture and everyday life. Specifically what Stanley calls the politics of sexual anxiety.
This remains a primary tool for division. It taps into that powerful emotional reaction against a threatened patriarchy.
And Stanley tracks the historical constancy of this mechanism. You link outgroups to narratives of sexual violence. Trump famously began his campaign by denouncing Mexican immigrants as rapists,
which directly parallels the German propaganda hysteria in the 1920s about the supposed mass rape of German women by African soldiers occupying the Rhineland.
And that German lie was then amplified by the Nazis, who linked it to a Jewish plot to destroy the white race. The mechanism is identical. Create a sexualized threat from the other to justify extreme measures.
We saw this play out in that small town, Twin Falls, Idaho. There was an accusation of sexual activity involving refugee boys.
And immediately, false articles circulated claiming the girl was gang raped at knife point by Syrian refugees and that their fathers celebrated. This immediate creation of a sexualized panic against immigrants is a classic globally deployed tactic.
And internally, we see it under the guise of protection, often targeting the most vulnerable members of society.
Like the North Carolina bathroom bill targeting transgender people, the entire debate was focused on the supposed sexual threat posed by transgender girls to cisgender girls.
It's a calculated effort to reinforce traditional male-centered gender hierarchies.
Absolutely. By defining who is a true man and who is a true woman, they're rebuilding that patriarchal structure. And since, in a fascist patriarchy, there is no greater perceived threat than the existence of trans women who cast doubt on the very definition and supremacy of maleness, they become the immediate focus.
And the leader becomes the hero who protects the real women.
Exactly.
Turning to education and critical thinking, the attack on the humanities, gender studies, sociology, Swahili, it's far from trivial, isn't it? It's an attack on the foundational capacity to be an effective democratic citizen.
Anti-democratic systems just cannot tolerate a population that has the tools to question authority or understand diverse perspectives or critically analyze historical narratives.
So the priority shifts entirely to skills-based education, training compliant workers.
And away from confronting the uncomfortable parts of history or understanding cultural diversity, it serves the interest of a political system that needs a docile, unified population that adheres strictly to the mythic past. The destruction of critical thinking is essential for the system's stability.
And perhaps the most insidious implication of Stanley's whole blueprint is the normalization of the intolerable. Mass incarceration, the brutal treatment of refugees and undocumented workers in detention centers, the use of torture. These were once considered morally extraordinary acts. Now they're becoming tolerated.
Stanley cites the work of the philosophers Joshua Knobe and Adam Baer, who studied how our judgments of normality actually work. And it's not just influenced by what is statistically typical.
It's also influenced by what we perceive as ideally proper.
Right. So as these extreme actions continue, they begin to register as more normal in our cognitive landscape. And this means that actions and speech that used to be considered shocking are just seen as less bad and hence less worthy of outrage.
So normalization transforms the morally extraordinary into the ordinary.
And that, in turn, makes charges of fascism, a word that carries the weight of this extreme historical evil, seem like an overreaction. Normalization is the process that lulls us into accepting extreme shifts in a society's norms until it's too late to resist.
Okay, let's connect Stanley's work back to our broader themes here at Crisis in Perception. First, this whole idea of systems versus individual blame.
Stanley gives us a critical illustration that fascism is fundamentally a system. It's based on recurring mechanisms, myth-making, propaganda, hierarchy that outlive any single leader.
It's an effective system because it redirects the anger caused by structural failures, like economic stagnation or status anxiety.
And it points that anger away from the system's beneficiaries, the economic elites, and onto vulnerable them groups.
So fixing the system isn't just about resisting a single politician or a single policy. It's about dismantling the tool set they all consistently use.
Right. If you remove the leader, but the tools and the incentives remain, a new leader will just pick them up.
Second, the system is characterized by power hidden in neutral processes. We've seen this repeatedly, how concepts we value, freedom of speech, hard work, objective history, are used as masks for power.
Du Bois's Propaganda of History detailed how historians were urged to use the ideals of truth and objectivity to craft a comforting fictional narrative of Reconstruction that justified stripping Black citizens of their voting rights.
And the concept of freedom, as economic libertarianism defines it, becomes just a mask for social Darwinism, minimizing regulation for the wealthy while maximizing hierarchy for everyone else.
And finally, the book shows us how moral narratives are embedded in institutions.
The legal system, economic ideology, education, they're all used to embed this core moral narrative, the deserving versus the undeserving, the maker versus the taker.
Exactly. And these moral narratives, which are often built on fictional, historical, or pseudoscientific links between race and criminality or laziness, they perpetually justify hierarchical policies that benefit the dominant group, all while claiming to uphold colorblind or neutral ideals. The institution itself validates the hierarchy.
So Jason Stanley has really provided us with a clear structural blueprint of fascist politics, a tool set of 10 mechanisms that are consistently deployed across time and countries to achieve ultranationalism and authoritarianism.
And that structural recognition, that's the key takeaway for you, the listener. It reveals that the goal is always division. It's the destruction of empathy by substituting fear and anger for reasoned debate.
Seeing these recurring patterns, the purposeful destruction of language, the mythic past, the inverted ideals, the creation of dominant group victimhood, that's essential.
And recognizing these patterns is the first step toward resisting the erosion of liberal democracy before these extreme policies become normal and socially accepted.
And this deep dive, it raises enormous questions for all of us that Stanley's analysis really pushes us to confront.
It does. Like, how do we maintain a sense of common humanity and mutual care in a society that is so prone to exploiting fear and insecurity?
And how can we strengthen the democratic institutions like labor unions, press freedom, and universal welfare that actively unite us across all our differences of race, gender, and religion?
So we can recognize our shared needs for food, for rest, for care for our families.
That is something we must all explore and work toward.
This deep dive was based on the book How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them by Jason Stanley.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.